Welcome to the Football Autobiography Show. I am so thrilled to be with you all today. I'm so excited to share this week's episode because it's such a special one and holds a special place in my heart. This past week, the English FA fired women's coach Mark Sampson, mostly due to the investigation involving player Eni Aluko. I won't rehash the entire situation. You can look that up online if you don't know already about it. But it's noteworthy in how it shined a light on the racism that's still part of today's game. In that same vein, I wanted to shed a light on another issue that doesn't get talked about nearly enough, but is nonetheless equally as important, and something that the FA should be focused on addressing in addition to racism. And that would be homophobia in football. This is an issue that hits close to home for me, and I'm extremely passionate about. My entire immediate family is gay. My brother, my two mothers, which has had a huge effect on my life. So, what is the situation like for homosexual players, coaches, staff, and fans in 2017? How has it changed since the 1970s? I'd like to answer those questions and more, which is why I'm thrilled to have on him as my guest today, Darryl Telles. Telles is the author of the new memoir, We're Queer and We Should Be Here, The Perils and Pleasures of Being a Gay Football Fan. Telles has been a Tottenham fan since 1970 and was one of the earliest members of the Gay Football Supporters Network and helped found Tottenham's gay supporters group, the Tottenham Hotspur Lilywhites. In this interview, Telles helps you walk a mile in his shoes and shows you what it was like to be a gay football fan in the 70s, and he explains how gay fanhood changed over time. He also discusses how a Nottingham Forest game in 1978 made him sick to his stomach, how one preseason friendly made him ashamed to be a Tottenham fan, the importance and formation of gay supporters groups, what the FA can do to make football in England more gay-friendly, and where he sees the issue in the future. Meeting Darryl was an absolutely incredible experience, and he certainly opened my eyes to what the situation is like for gays in the game today. If you liked the interview, check out his book, which you can find a link to on my website, footballautobiographyshow.com, and also Darryl will be at Houseman's Bookshop on October 6th at 7 p.m. to sign books and discuss it further. This interview is absolutely so personal for me, but I hope you guys really enjoy it and get a lot out of it. And I promise you, there's nothing like this out on the internet, and this is a perspective that really everyone needs to know about and hear about. And I think is really important for any football fan, player, or coach. So please enjoy this episode with Darryl Telles. I'm here in the Cramley Nature Park Reserve with Darryl Telles. Darryl, how are you doing today?
Hi, it's a lovely day. Very nice venue in the middle of central London to be in a park and a nature reserve.
Yeah, right by the canal and around a bunch of birds, and it's beautiful out.
Yes.
So thank you so much for coming on the
That's
on the
okay,
show.
yes. I'm really pleased to be here, yes.
In your book, you go through 40 plus years of being a Tottenham football fan. What is your first memory of watching football?
I think it must be on the television, and it must be around 1970. I certainly remember the cup final of that year because Chelsea were playing Leeds. My brother was a big Chelsea fan. And I remember that it was an odd game because it actually went to a replay, which was the first time in 80 odd years. So I remember that. And I also remember the World Cup quite vividly in 1970 because it was England were champions, would you believe? And yes, there was a real expectation that England would do very well. And of course I remember the Brazilians, just marvellous, just wonderful players. And for a person of colour like me, it was just amazing to see a team full of style and flair, etc.
You say your brother was a Chelsea fan, so why were you a Tottenham fan?
Well, as the book says, we were asked by two skinheads actually that we met. One was a Spurs fan and one was a Chelsea fan, so he chose Chelsea and I chose Spurs, and it just stuck with me. Also, I'm from Finchley, and so it's either Spurs or the other side. And I went for the right side in terms of Tottenham Hotspur, in terms of being the nearest Premiership club.
And what was your first game like going to Tottenham?
Well, I didn't actually go until 1978, so I was about 14, just after my 14th birthday. Now, the reason for that is that there was a lot of hooliganism in those days, so my mum wasn't thought I wouldn't be safe if I went to Spurs, so I went with a friend from school, and it was just amazing because, of course, in those days you had terraces, so you were in amongst all these people shoving and pushing, the excitement of the crowd, and also Tottenham had just come up from the second division. We had just spent 1 year in the second division. We just signed Ardiles and Villa from Argentina, who won the World Cup. So it was full of excitement and a bit of fear and trepidation. I can remember it quite vividly, yes.
And at that point, had you already come out? Or did you, or better yet, did you know you were gay at that point?
Yeah, I think I knew I was gay since I was about 8, actually, 7 or 8, so quite early. And I hadn't actually come out. But I think I knew to myself that this wasn't a phase I was going through or anything. So, I would say I was gay when I watched the game. I hadn't met someone else, so I hadn't had any sexual experiences. But I did know I was gay.
And so, how did you come out to your family and to your friends?
Well, I won't spoil the book because there is a passage in the book about how I came out to my mother, which was quite drastic. But I suppose officially I came out after university, when I had a boyfriend, etc. And although it was initially quite difficult, I have to say my mother has been quite supportive, very supportive this year in doing the book and in the last few years. So I would say that I came out to almost everyone when I was about 19, 20, and certainly I've never worked in a job since where I haven't been out,
And so, what were the reactions like? Were they surprised, or your friends? Maybe not your parents, but your friends.
I think most of my friends sort of knew because I was at university, so it wasn't much of a surprise to them. Also, because I was in sort of radical left circles, they were very supportive. I think there was only one friend that took it badly and that I was quite upset about, but in amongst dozens of friends that really didn't concern me. It was quite a supportive environment.
And so at this point you're obviously still a huge Tottenham fan, so at what point did you decide to become one of the earliest members of the Gay Supporters Football Network, and how did that come about?
Well, when I came back from university, which was in 1986, I really couldn't go to football. One, because I didn't have friends that actually went to Spurs. It was I sort of got disconnected with my friends from school. And also, the occasions that I did go on my own, I felt quite isolated and vulnerable as a gay fan. And it was only in 1980, so I went to 1 or 2 games, but not regularly. It was only in 1989 when I saw an advert in Gay Times about the establishment of a gay football supporters network that I replied to it and went to my first meeting, which was, I think, around the autumn of 1989.
And so you mentioned you felt vulnerable and alone at those games. Can you compare and contrast what it was like when you finally joined the Gay Supporters Football Network compared to going by yourself?
It was just, it was just like heaven, really, because I always thought that I was probably only one of really few gay men that supported football for football's sake and that was really into the game. When I went to GFSN, I just found so many more, who were really into football, that I thought, God, this is brilliant. And the friends that I made then, I still are very close friends now. So it was a real upheaval, a real change in my life, because football means so much to me, that though 1989 to say 1991, when I finally bought a season ticket, was, when I look back, quite important. Because if I used to go on my own, you'd hear comments, you'd have to just keep quiet, or if people made the odd sexist remark, you'd have to almost comply with it, etc., or just forget about it. Now with a group, we could keep ourselves to ourselves and be quite open, particularly at home games.
You say they would make a remark. Did it ever get above a remark into maybe a chant or something of that nature?
Yeah. Well, funny enough, in my first game in 1978, we were playing Nottingham Forest, and as you'll read in the book, Forest had just won the league, and so it was a very big game. But their manager, Brian Clough, was taunted about being a homosexual. And there was singing from the terraces because of his friendship with his assistant manager Peter Taylor at the time. And so, from my first game there were always chants of that nature, but there was also comments, that were made, like faggot or queer, or which were just said almost all the time in the late 70s, early 80s. No one thought about it at all.
And so which hurt you more? Was it the remarks or the chants or the singing?
I would say sometimes the remarks, in a sense, because you'd be talking to people around you and then suddenly they could say these remarks. And also, of course, being Asian, there was also a lot of racism that was still prevalent. And in fact, that was, I would say, much more cutting and much more horrible, particularly in the 70s. Yeah, when I came back in the late 80s to football after university, there was far more black players. So that had subsided slightly, the aggressive chanting, but there was still remarks of a racist nature.
And you mentioned that you had finally found a group of supporters that were like you, but did they all have similar experiences to yours before coming into the group?
I think they did, yeah. Some of them weren't out totally, and in fact the group catered for both people that were out and weren't out. But I think they did have experiences of enjoying football, playing football when they were younger, but then realising their sexuality almost was like an invisible barrier to them either participating in football or going to games, and finding themselves watching it in isolation, because also the gay press at the time were heavily anti-football, in the sense that they just saw football as full of straight misogynist men who were homophobic, etc. And although some were, it wasn't the majority, so there was nothing for them and for me to hook ourselves onto, being gay and into football.
And for the fans that are listening out there, are these all Tottenham fans that are a part of the supporters network?
No, we had at the time, so we sort of started in 1989, and then what really boosted our membership was the World Cup in 1990. And if some of your listeners might recall, that it was a really good World Cup for England, and it was very popular in the sense that it was sort of a reawakening, of sort of renaissance of what football should really be about. And so many members joined then. We had about 300 members, as I said. Most of the members were active members, certainly in London, were either Arsenal or Spurs fans. So there was great rivalry between us.
Well, one of I mean, the 1990 World Cup was really special for England because of that great run in the semifinals, and
Yes.
especially, Paul Gascoigne, a
Yeah.
Tottenham fan, and he was crying. And
Yes.
in the book, you mentioned how that had a deep impact on you.
Yes, it did. It did at the time, and I think it was almost like I think gay men particularly can resonate with that because he was showing emotion, he was showing his vulnerability, he was also showing his passion. And I think that resonated with a lot of us at the time. He was also the best player in the world for the first season that I went back to Tottenham, 1990 to 91. We saw the best player in the world playing for our club. So it was a very magical moment.
Now, for people that weren't of a younger generation like myself, can you kind of describe being gay in the 70s versus what you're talking about now, maybe in the 90s, and how it changed?
Okay, I mean, yeah, it seems generations ago, and I suppose now it is at least a generation. But one of the things about the book is that it's published in the 50th year of the decriminalisation of homosexuality in England and Wales for gay men. And if you look back to the late 70s when I came out, say 78, 79, or at least I knew I was gay, it was just over 10 years since it wasn't a crime. So there was still a majority feeling, if you look at surveys, a very strong majority, I would say 70 to 80% of the population, who would say that gay sex was unnatural, who would say that it was an abomination, and although they tolerated it, they certainly didn't want to see it. So the law said you could only do it if you were over 21 and you were in a private home. And I think the law reflected what most people thought at the time. So as a young man growing up in that environment, I thought I had a problem that I had to deal with. I didn't accept it. I thought it was a problem, almost like a disease. That's how it felt, that I was inflicted with something. By the 1990s, as I found gay friends, very close gay friends, and realised that there was a gay community, a thriving gay community, there seemed to be more, from tolerance, there seemed to be more of an understanding of what we faced. And of course in the 80s and especially in the early 90s we went through the AIDS crisis, which of course was terrible, but one of the consequences of that was quite beneficial because gay men were out, because of that, and people were talking about gay sex and the reality of gay life. So in the early 1990s, from being stigmatized, there was a slow, but a very slow sense of a beginning of an understanding of some of the issues, and, as I said, a feeling of community as well.
Yeah. Now, when you were before you had joined the GFSN, when you were at games and you felt alone, where did you gather the strength to kind of be above it and to endure it?
Well, I have to be honest, I didn't, and that's why I stopped going to games. I only went to one or two, maybe, a season, which for someone who's really into football was a bit sad, really. So I had to watch it on television, and also I did have some straight friends as well that I went to games with who appreciated the fact that I was gay. So, but then of course GFSN came along, and that really changed my life.
And you mentioned one of the most striking stories from the book is when you're in Brighton and you're at a Brighton Tottenham game in 2011 at it's a preseason friendly.
Yeah.
Can you kind of take the listeners through that day?
Well, it was. I'd moved down to Brighton in the March of that year because my work had relocated to London Bridge. I've got friends in Brighton, and so it made sense. London had become, for a middle-aged man who lived on his own, quite lonely and not friendly and quite expensive. Brighton seemed more gay-friendly in particular, but also just more neighbourly. So I moved there. And the first game of Brighton's inaugural season in the Amex Stadium, which is a great stadium, was against Tottenham. It was a friendly, so I went along. And yeah, I got quite upset, really, because again, there was homophobic chanting, which started off, well, I can't even say it started off mild-mannered and in a humorous way, because I don't think any of that is actually banter from the Tottenham fans. And there I was, as a gay man, I was on my own, again confronted by my own side singing this chanting. And I felt, again, quite angry this time that I couldn't challenge it or do things about it. So I think it was then that I began to think, you know, looking back on all the years, maybe some things haven't changed, you know, and maybe I need to write a book. And that's where I began to think about writing this book.
In that moment when they're chanting, though, you say you couldn't do anything. Is it possible to talk to security, or do you think they wouldn't listen to that if you had gone to them?
That's a good point, really, and I didn't. I just sat there seething and looking angry and not involved. I think the problem is in those days when it's a whole group chanting, there's very little the stewards can do other than sit down, ask people to sit down. I suppose what I would like to see is perhaps public address systems, you know, so people saying on the public systems, addressing the issue, etc. Yeah, when it's a remark from an individual or so, it's easier to take up. And I don't feel confident enough when it's a group, I have to say. Even now, after almost 30 years of being out on the terraces, confronting a whole group, I think I would find that difficult, unless there were people with me.
Yeah, it must be scary.
Well, I think it is, and particularly when it's your own fans, you know.
And later that year, they actually came... Brighton actually came up to Tottenham.
Yes, it was actually it was a couple of seasons later. I think it was 2013. We played, or maybe even 2014. We played them in a League Cup game, and the Proud Lilywhites had only just been formed, and so this was a great test of our role, really, because this is our manor, this is our home, White Hart Lane, and we don't want a repetition of what happened there. And
thanks for bringing that up, because I wanted to get into the Tottenham Lilywhites, which is the gay supporters group of Tottenham. What, for people that don't know, what is the role of the Lilywhites?
Well, in about 2011-12, there was a real wave of feeling that some of the chantings, in particular Spurs were singing at the time against Sol Campbell, who went to Arsenal, was particularly offensive and particularly racist and homophobic. And the Spurs, for their credit, Spurs management and Spurs authorities, the club, stood against it by saying that anyone found chanting homophobic remarks would be barred from the ground. And they also approached the Gay Football Supporters Network to set up a fan group, a supporters club for LGBT fans. So now it's a real recognition of, I suppose, our group, but also an inclusion, because of course the groups that I've in the 80s and stuff were predominantly male and predominantly gay. Now we're talking about lesbians and bisexuals, trans people joining in as well, and official recognition. So that felt like all your summers come home at once, when we got official backing and recognition and help. There were things in the programme about us, there was things on the website, and most importantly, there was a massive rainbow flag at games, which I'm sure your listeners will have seen, because that's gone all over the world through television.
And what effects do you think the Lilywhites have had on Tottenham and the sort of atmosphere there?
Well, it certainly helped at Brighton. We didn't have one reported incident of homophobic chanting, and I think anecdotally we heard that if fans were beginning to think of chanting that, other fans were self-policing them and saying, you can't chant that because we've got gay fans. Look at the Proud Lilywhites flag, which is exactly the position we should be in, where other fans sort of police the situation. So I think there was a massive impact on people's awareness that there are actually gay fans. I think a lot of it was just ignorance. People were making these remarks thinking that no one would find them offensive. Well, there are LGBT fans, but there are also now increasingly numbers of people who know someone who's gay or lesbian or trans quite close to them. Family members, people at work, etc. So it's not only us that would get offended by them, but I think a wider range of people. And also it's not conducive to a family atmosphere, I think. That's the bottom line, really.
Are you satisfied with the progress?
I am. Tottenham have been really good. They've, as I said, always acknowledged us in all their football channels. We see players now involving in the Football Against Homophobia campaign, wearing rainbow laces, T-shirts, promoting the idea. So, we're at a very comfortable stage now with LGBT inclusion and awareness at Spurs.
Something that strikes me as interesting, just specifically with Tottenham, is they're on the other end of a lot of anti-Jewish remarks. So it strikes me as really interesting because they're giving a lot of similar remarks, just not about obviously Jewish people, but about gay people. How did you reconcile that with fans there, or did that make sense to you?
I don't think it makes sense to anyone, really, because you're absolutely right, Josh. If you begin to look at it, you're actually hitting back at another minority, But I don't think people, football fans are that sophisticated and think about it in that way. I think they just want to get at the other team and use anything they can to get at them. But no, I think the club is saying, and certainly Proud Lilywhites are saying, that you can still be passionate, you can still get behind the team, you just have to lose some of the offensiveness about it.
There are, you mentioned in the book, there's some other gay supporter groups like the Gay Gooners, and then Norwich City has one, Manchester City. Where do you see? How many more do you see coming in future years?
Well, I hope every team, in certainly the 92, the pyramid, the first 92 teams, will have an LGBT group. There's now 30, which when Proud Lilywhites were formed, there was only 4. So it just shows you within 3 years there's been a blossoming of groups. So I think there's only a couple now of Premier League sides that don't have an official LGBT group. I have to say Manchester United among them, who also don't have a women's team, so they really need to up their game. So I just see it happening everywhere,
I want to talk about some common misconceptions. There's a common assumption that a lot of fans do this type of anti-gay talk or chanting when they're drunk. How true did you find that?
Well, it does happen when people are drunk, but it also happens when people are quite sober. So if you got rid of alcohol, I don't think you'd solve the problem totally. I think you just have to challenge it whenever it occurs, if you can.
You mentioned in the book you get to the opportunity to meet a lot of people, a lot of players, a lot of referees, and how did you find their reactions to the work that the Lilywhites and a lot of the other gay supporter groups or networks were doing?
Touchwood, really supportive and always willing to endorse anything that happens. I still think, however, in terms of homophobia, we need to up our games. I think you find it quite easy to get players to speak about racism, anti-racism, and also women's football. I think there is still a problem of top flight footballers speaking out against homophobia. I was really pleased to see Paul Pogba say recently that he would have no problems if a gay player came out. It would be great to see a lot more of that, particularly from international players who seem, some of them, to be quite silent on the issue. And I think sometimes there's a fear of being associated with the issue. I can't understand it, but there does seem to be that fear. So I would like to see much more endorsement of things like Football Against Homophobia campaign coming from players themselves. I still think there's a slight tendency to talk about racism, women's football, but not really talk about the issues affecting LGBT fans.
What do you think that teams or the FA or FIFA could better do? Because obviously, there's only so much you can do with the players, but
well, yeah, the authorities. I mean, I'm very sad, and I say so in the book, that the FA, for example, are led by people who think that they won't see out gay players because of the hostility that will generate among supporters. I think that's the wrong thing to say. I think that's the wrong thing to say in principle, but I also think practically it's wrong, because I actually think things have changed on the terraces and will do if players come out. So sometimes the authorities, particularly the FA, seem quite muddled and scared about the issue when they really shouldn't be. And I think they need to grasp the initiative and really support campaigns, not just when a player comes out or if a player comes out, but continuously. One of the things I talk about in my book, for example, is that equality training. People are sent on courses if they make a remark or etc. Well, I think every coach, every manager, every chairman, if you're fit for purpose, you need to have some equalities awareness from the beginning. So I'd like to see everyone involved in a training program, not just those who say offend. If we were giving that clear message, then I think we'll see much more young gay men and women in academies coming out at the earlier point of their career, and then being able to be gay or lesbian, bisexual, trans throughout their career.
Well, we saw it with the Eni Aluko situation. Obviously it's different, but with the racism. But she talks about how there needs to be some equality training by all coaches as well.
Definitely, Josh, and I think that's the issue. I think the FA seems to think that it's supporters that will react. Now, there may be a reaction, but then you tackle that. I think there's still an acceptance of a macho, very bullying and abusive culture, or on the bench and in the dressing room, and I think that's persuasive, and I think it persuades a lot of players who are gay not to come out. That's where the real issues need to be tackled. The more and more that I speak to footballers, or as you mentioned the recent case, the more and more it's becoming clear that it's that culture within football, not on the terraces, that needs to change.
You mentioned footballers kind of need to come out, but also what about coaches and trainers? I know the Bournemouth photographer is very open, and she's transgendered. But what about coaches, scouts? It doesn't seem like...
I mean, it must be all the way through. We were talking earlier about a referee who's come out, the first professional referee. So yes, it must go through the whole of football. We've got to remember that at the end of the day, a football is a career for a lot of people and a workplace. And like any other workplace or careers, it's now not acceptable for gay men to have to remain in the closet. And so football really does need to catch up.
And so how long do you think it might take before someone comes out, whether it's a coach, like a coach or a player? We'll stick with those two.
Well, I think it might be that we might see that in the academies and with younger players. Hopefully we will see that in the not too distant future. And I think once one or two come out, I think then there will be a general acceptance, like it was with the profile of black players, etc., and like women referees. I think there might be a backlash to begin with, but then I think over time people will just say whatever someone's sexuality is, that isn't a barrier. It's about how good that player is and how fair and respectful that coach is.
You say not too distant future. What are you talking like 5-10 years? Are you talking like 20-30 years?
I don't know. I really don't know. I mean, I think football really, we've been saying, in the next season and in the next couple of years, etc. So I'm not going to talk about time. I don't know. Football is so far behind other sports, but I think it will. In my lifetime, I think hopefully we will see not just one but a number of gay footballers openly playing in leagues in Europe, certainly.
If you were a football player, football coach, would you come out?
I think I'd have to, because I have in my life come out where I work, to my family and to my employees and employers and to my friends, etc. I couldn't envisage not being out to everyone. I couldn't envisage the pressure that would put on me. And I think what happens probably is that a lot of gay footballers, because of that pressure, quit the game. I think we're losing gay footballers at an earlier age than we think. And no, I'd have to be out, but I'm not good enough to play football.
So what's your favorite home game you've ever been to? You've been going for a long time now. Favorite home game you've been to? Favorite away game you've been to? Because you've been to many, and you chronicle numerous away trips that you take.
Yeah, well, actually, it's not so difficult, because my home game is 1984. And actually, I was still in the closet then. We came up from university. There was a minibus of us, and we actually saw Spurs win a trophy. That won't happen again. You won't win a trophy in your home ground. It'll be on a neutral ground. So to actually win a European trophy, it was the UEFA Cup final, 1984. We were playing Anderlecht, went all the way to extra time, then penalties, and Tottenham won on the penalty shootout. So that's my favourite game at home at the Lane. My favourite away game is also quite peculiar, because it's one we actually lost. So it just shows you the result sometimes is not that important. It was in 2011, I think, so much earlier than the favourite home game, and it was against Real Madrid. We were 4-0 down, and of course we nearly got a point. It was in the Champions League. We saw a marvellous second half by Gareth Bale.
Wasn't that Inter Milan? Or am
Sorry.
Confusing?
Yes, it was Inter Milan.
Okay.
Big mistake. I said Real Madrid because we've just drawn them in the draw, and they're on my mind. You're absolutely right. And of course we were in the Bernabeu, so that's why I said Real Madrid. But and Gareth has since gone to play for them. But I don't think I've ever seen one player almost single-handedly turn around a game. And I mean, after that game, it was like Gaza in 1990, where we spoke about earlier. Everyone was talking about Gareth Bale across Europe because of that amazing show. And the Bernabeu is still a really great stadium. So although we lost 4-3 to Inter Milan at the Bernabeu, that remains my best away game.
Yeah, I've been to the Bernabeu.
Yeah.
The Bernabeu is actually in Madrid. That's the San Siro is the
Yeah.
Inter Milan one. But who? So is Gareth
Oh,
Bale?
sorry.
Sorry, I hate. No. So is Gareth Bale your favorite player?
At the time, yes, he was a real favourite of mine. But I've had lots of favourite players over the times. I think the favourite ones are those that are most loyal. So if you go back to the 70s, it's Steve Perriman for me, who was our captain. And the other thing I like about players who are dependable. So they might not be the best players on the pitch, but they can play in different positions. So we had Steve Perriman in the 70s and early 80s. And then we had Gary Mabbott in the 80s and 90s, and then of course Ledley King as well. Really dependable but quality players that would always be the first person you selected, but not necessarily the first person you think of. I think those three players are my best ever Spurs player.
And what requests do you have for the audience? I asked this to all my guests. What do you want out of the audience?
Well, I think it was you're all football fans. Just think sometimes about the effect that you have at a game or in a group to people who aren't into football, and just perhaps be an ambassador for the sport more. It sounds quite chivalrous and quite British to say it's only a game, but yeah, you can still be passionate, you can still get behind the team, but I just wish we'd drop being all offensive and the alpha male qualities sometimes that we think are essential, because I don't think they are.
How can fans interact or connect with you? How can they reach you?
Well, they can go on Facebook. I've got a page about the book, Darryl Telles, author. We're queer and we'll still be here, and I hope to be doing lots of talks and over the coming season about the book. And if anyone wants me to come and talk to their supporters group or whoever, I'd be more than welcome to. And I'll remember to keep the San Siro and the Bernabeu different. Sorry.
No worries. Thank you for coming and joining the show.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's been great.
Thanks for listening to the show. If you enjoyed it, subscribe to it on iTunes, Stitcher, Podcast Addict, Acast, or any podcasting catching app. Want to learn more about the guests and go behind the scenes? Then go to my website, www.footballautobiography.com, and subscribe to my newsletter. Also, if you like the show, or even if you hated it, leave a comment on either my Twitter page @footballautobio or my Facebook page, The Football Autobiography Show. I welcome and would appreciate any feedback from you all. Thanks for listening. Take care.